Okay, well, I guess I'm the guest, but I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? What do you think about the future of nuclear energy in the world, but particularly in Japan?
Particularly in Japan, I think, unfortunately, people have the perception with regards to nuclear energy that it's dangerous, and that it's inherently dangerous, and more so in Japan because of the fact that we have earthquakes and tsunami. But the reality is, the problems that they had with the reactors were mainly due to the fact that they're outdated. They're using outdated technologies. It was GE that came in and developed the system 50 years ago in conjunction with Toshiba, I believe.
Yeah.
And they hadn't even maintained the sites. There were scheduled maintenances. There were reports that had been released that it was necessary for them to take measures in order to protect them from exactly what had happened, specifically the tsunami, more so than the earthquake. But what people fail to recognize is that because it was outdated technology, they ran into these issues. But newer technologies that do exist for nuclear are much safer and much smaller in scale. They don't rely on the same cooling systems that existing technology does. So I think that Japan, when we talk about alternative energy sources, we have solar, we have wind, we have thermal, geothermal. And Japan is aggressively pursuing many of these options. Unfortunately, sort of at the sacrifice of affordable energy. Especially through their feed-in tariff system that they've just recently, last year, came out with for specifically solar and wind. So I think that going forward, when we talk about conversion efficiencies with the photovoltaic technologies and wind, there is something promising in it, but for the general production of energy at the scale required for, powering a city like Tokyo, you really haven't got any other options than nuclear, to be entirely honest. You can continue to burn coal, you can continue to burn fossil fuels, but as the cost of fuel continues to increase, and of course Japan doesn't have any natural resources in those commodities, the price of energy would be inhibiting, and would force them again to pursue nuclear. I think it's just going to have to.
Well, I think that Abe made a statement about that a week or two ago. And of course, people flipped out because they talked about, we're aiming for zero, and I agree with you. I don't think it's possible. I would differ with you. I think obviously new technologies are definitely better and definitely safer, but I think actually in some ways what happened at Fukushima proves that the technology is actually quite safe. So what you had is an old plant was poorly maintained.
Yeah.
To some degree, there's an argument about how poorly maintained.
Yeah.
That had its diesel generators for the backup cooling in the wrong place, and there's a once in 1,000-year seismic event. Given those four situations, the fact that we're not running around with two heads, I think says to a certain degree how safe that technology is. The WHO report came out this week, and using very conservative estimates, they showed that there's only, I think, 3 groups of people for whom cancer risks will go up. Mm-hmm. One, obviously, workers at the plant.
Yeah.
But then there might have been more than this. The 3 highest ones were the people who were at the plant. They might have a slightly higher cancer risk. But then it was infant boys who had a slightly increased risk. It was, I think, 5% relative risk
of thyroid.
No. This one was leukemia.
Okay.
And then infant girls, and this was the big headline: 70% increase. Yeah, but except that thyroid cancers are so rare in young people normally that we're talking going from what it was 0.77 to or so 1.25 or something like this. And even this is using the most conservative model, and they don't even know if anyone has actually been exposed to that degree. They didn't take the information based on exposure to populations. They sort of guessed this area got exposed to this much.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of how they did it. But they were being very conservative, and these were the numbers they came up with. So I think given that. So I mean, all of that sounds awful. I mean, anything that can do this kind of thing sounds awful. But I think the key thing is to put it in perspective. Coal releases way more radioactive gas, actually radon gas, than nuclear. In not just radioactive, it releases more radiation than nuclear when it's running properly.
Yeah.
Right. Not to mention the fact that the greenhouse gases are probably more dangerous to the whole world than being able to run uranium plants. I agree. We need to move to new technology because we're only burning like 1 or 2% of the available energy.
It's
in uranium.
not. Well, the older plants are also very inefficient and expensive.
Yes.
So moving to the new technology will enable them to run on.
But I think the reason I want to make
this
point is that I think that after inspections, we should start turning stuff back on.
Oh yeah.
I think we're being way too cautious. Yeah. And in the meantime, it's costing us. And I don't want to sound like a grumpy guy who complains about his electrical bill, but holy shit, my electrical bill
has gone
doubled.
up significantly. Yeah, it has.
And at the end of the day, and I don't.
We're footing the bill.
Yeah, and this is the weird thing is because I look at this and I'm usually a bit like I'm a bit on the loony left, and I'm like I'm against like constant growth as an economic model and blah 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 blah. But I think the key actually to prosperity, and I don't mean that in terms of an economic growth sense. I mean that in terms of each person in the world being able to have a standard of living. That's nice. That's comparable to what we have.
Yeah.
I think the only way we're going to do that is with something like nuclear power that can deliver cheap power. We have enough like fissionable material. So the uranium that's already out of the ground plus the thorium. If you start building thorium reactors, we could power the world for thousands of years on that.
Yeah.
And
even given the population growth that we're experiencing.
Exactly. And so I mean, power is so integral to developing regions that are behind, so to speak.
Yeah.
That where things like it affects everything up the line from like clean water to Yeah, well, I mean, and this is the thing. I think obviously there are risks, but you need to put them in perspective with every other form of generating energy. Wind has risks, solar has risks, and I know it sounds like, oh, I'm an apologist or whatever, but I mean, aside from the fact that rooftop solar is risky because roofing is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, because people fall off, like, in terms of per kilowatt generated, more people are killed from rooftop solar because of falls. But just the chemicals that go into making these things, until we find a way of doing this that doesn't involve these crazy ass chemicals.
Well,
there's a huge chemical leak in China at a solar plant, and it barely even makes the news.
But there are new technologies like graphene that are going to help push these photovoltaic technologies into the next generation that can allow you to get away from some of the elements that are required now.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, again, it's like you say, it's like capacity.
Yeah.
And even if we put one of those on every single building, especially in the northern hemisphere, especially when you go further north into well, you forget Hokkaido, but like look at other countries, Finland, right? How much of the year is it in darkness? And
well, they also have geothermal in those regions of the area as well.
Yeah. Geothermal is actually a lot more tricky too than people think. I don't mean in terms of danger. I just mean in terms of actually because it can move around.
Yeah.
And it's in fact some of the more seismically stable areas that have the most reliable geothermal. I was reading, like Australia apparently. Yeah. Because it doesn't shift the way it does when things are more seismically active.
But there's also a lot of wind installation in Australia off the coasts because that's a year-round sort of consequence of the area.
I think the main disadvantage to wind and solar is the footprint, because if you're an environmentalist, you don't want these taking up huge amounts of huge tracts of land necessarily. And people will say things like put them in the desert, but the desert,
which is what they do in China.
But the problem is the desert is actually it has a very fragile ecosystem because of the little bit of rain that it gets. You don't. It's like the tundra. You go walking the South Pole and like that. you step on a piece of moss. That piece of moss is not gonna regrow. It's gonna have your footprint in it for the next 100,000 years or something. I'm pulling this out of my ass. Please don't take this as scientific, but do you know what I mean? Like these environments are sensitive, and so
but you can argue that the footprint required for a solar installation in a desert is going to be minimal impact-wise on the entire ecosystem of the desert.
Well, but I would suggest that a nuclear power station in the same place would be a smaller footprint even than that, because if you're not using water as coolant, you don't need to be on the coast.
Exactly, which is why you can't put it in a desert.
Right? No, you can if you're not using water as a coolant. If you're using a different coolant, if you're using like molten salt or something, you don't necessarily need it. You don't necessarily need it to be right there. But the fact is, physically they take up, especially the newer ones that you're talking about, they take up less space.
Yeah.
And especially, as nice as the idea of wind is, I don't know if we want to see giant, especially in Japan, giant tracts of our wilderness filled with.
Well, that's why
windmills.
They tend to put them off the coast, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to Finland, Germany, you'll see a lot of wind installations in hills, that just are typically uninhabited.
Right. Although, Germany is actually a good example because they shut down their nuclear program. They shut down their nuclear power program, and now they've actually built more coal plants to make up the difference because they can't ramp up the wind and solar fast enough. And the question remains, how far can they ramp it up? I mean, you put say X number of gigawatts of solar in somewhere. How many does that actually? That's just the maximum. That's just the rating of the thing. Yeah. How much can it actually deliver? And that's really the question. And hopefully, as technologies improve, that's going to improve. But I think that we can't ignore a technology that can already provide the power.
They do calculate. I mean, we do have mechanisms of calculating. Based on region, based on daylight hours. On a cyclical basis. How many watts can be generated on an hourly basis. But I'm very positive going forward with photovoltaic. I think that the sun is the most abundant source of energy on the planet, and as I don't think that we're there yet. But as technologies progress, we will, and I think a lot of the the nanotechnologies that have been developed recently help to improve efficiencies, so that you're getting better conversion rates with smaller square footage, which is what, of course, is necessary with these technologies.
Right.
But I think that it's going to require a an overhaul of the existing systems, because you need these smart grid technologies that are going to enable you. I mean, the problem with solar right now is there's just no way to store excess power.
Yeah, exactly. You have to use it. You have to use power when it's generated.
Exactly, and which is why you're still going to be dependent on nuclear
and thermal to some small degree, because sometimes you need to be able to step it up just by so much, or there's no way you're going to get rid of any one thing, but. I mean, my feeling is that the immediate emergency is to reduce thermal to as low as possible because of the effect it's having on the environment. And I think what bugs me most about the environmental movement is that they're with the science on global warming, but not with the science on energy. And it's really frustrating to watch, because it's like you can't win that battle without also fighting this battle.
Yeah.
And you guys are on the wrong side.
Yeah.
And
for go back to photovoltaic, I've heard people argue that the amount of power necessary, the amount of energy necessary to create a module, is actually more than that module will produce over its lifetime, which is true if you're considering all of the components and how they're being developed and whatnot. But I think that's an argument that is going to be short-lived, because eventually you'll have solar power plants that are powered by solar, so it's going to be feeding itself in that regard. I guess I'm more optimistic about solar than you are.
It's not that I'm not optimistic. It just, to me, it feels like one of those things where they're like, it's 5 years away, and they always say it's 5 years away.
I don't.
Because they've been saying it since I was in junior high.
Yeah.
Like, it's 5 years away. But then we have a technology that's already here, has been tested, and is working. And I'm like, you know what? It's great. If that works out, wonderful. We're not going to be in a bad situation. That'll be great. But we need to deal with the problem now.
Yeah.
We can't wait 5 years.
Well, let me say there is one good thing that has come of this.
Yeah. Which is what?
Tokyo has become dimmer.
Has it?
Yes. and what I mean is when you're walking through the subways, when you're walking through, and you're in the a lot of the department stores and whatnot, they've been required, to reduce power consumption, and of course the lighting systems in these facilities are a huge contributor to overall power consumption. So what they've done is they've taken out half of the lighting, and to me, Japan has always been too bright, and the Japanese like bright areas for public space. But in the West, or especially I think in Europe as well, still the West, I'm referencing America and Europe, but we tend to like lower ambient light.
Right.
And even in very public spaces like shopping centers and whatnot. And I think that people are taking a different approach now to lighting design in Tokyo, in Japan in general, that makes it more comfortable, I guess, for me. I mean, before it was just, when you think about it, you go into certain shops and there's so much even heat being generated by all the lighting. And you'll literally, it'll be winter, you'll go into a shop, you have to take off your jacket because it's so freaking hot and you get sweating. So I think that's one good thing that's come about.
Someone needs to tell my local pachinko parlor about this.
Oh yeah, those guys, they don't care. I mean, look at the business that they're in.
Yeah.
They could give a damn. But if you're going through stations and whatnot, you'll see that half of the fluorescent lights have been unplugged.
Huh.
And actually, people are moving to more efficient lighting technologies like LED. I think that's one of the positive things that have come out.
Yeah, well, I think we're much more aware of our consumption. I've had my toilet seat heaters unplugged since 311 now.
I won't give that up.
I wouldn't originally, but then I ended up doing it when I was looking online, and I saw that actually uses more energy than my air conditioner, and I thought, well, it's summer now. I'd rather have the air conditioner. I'd rather have the air conditioner. I'd rather have the air conditioner.
I mean, you could
It's
feel
nuclear
them
fallout.
attacking
It's nuclear fallout.
Yeah. I think we got worse problem with Sugi than we do here.